My name is Johnny. I'm SOUTHWORKS CTO. I will expand on that PaaS to SaaS first. So this is a customer that, was looking to change the way they were doing business. And what they had before was these VMs that they could deploy on any customer subscription. They will use things like Packer to create the images and deploy them and eventually manage all of these. However, the customers were like, hey, we are spending a lot, running a lot of these VMs within our context. We just want to pay for the service. It doesn't make sense to, have this infrastructure that we are liable for and a lot of things. And they came to us looking for a solution in which they would need to combine a hybrid model, meaning that there will be some customers that would like to run these completely separate from the world, running their own thing. And some of them, which will be fine on a shared environment with the proper compliance, security, and privacy concerns. So in that particular case, what we did is we leverage Crossplane, Argo, we containerize all the workloads. We use things like the virtual clusters and isolation to determine who's running where and the access and the level of resources and those sort of things. We allow them to sell their product as SaaS. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. So on something like this, what's the rough time frame that it took you to do the project, and what's the size of the team that you're using?
So in this particular case, we use 3 squads that we call fire teams. These are teams of 3 people for a 9-month time frame. It wasn't all all in or nothing. So by month 5, we were able to serve the existing customers that were already running on an isolated deployment, and the other 4 were used to convert into a SaaS and allow that new revenue work stream.
And is this a case of they didn't have the skill set to do it, or you're accelerating their time to do it, or what's sort of the real win here for the customer?
Both. So one was timing. When I met with their CTO, the question was like, hey, we've been thinking about this. My plans are 2 years and 20 people. And I was like, hey, we've done this 20 times before, so we'll get you in half of that. The other thing is as they were looking into retraining their team, they wanted to be more agnostic, meaning that I would rather spend my money teaching people Kubernetes and Crossplane and Argo rather than the specific Azure or AWS or GCP services. So it was a matter of skill. They were willing to, reskill their workforce, but they were worried about this, what if tomorrow we have a customer from China that comes asking for Alibaba Cloud and we need to learn the whole thing over again? And the other was time to market. They need to run. Good. So we enable this, SaaS transformation on their end. It was interesting because the foundation of the solution remained pretty much the same. So we included the multi-tenancy was built around Kubernetes and a lot of the native services of the Kubernetes cluster and operators and such, rather than, hey, let's rewrite your product, right? That was one of the key points. Then we created all these mechanisms for drift detection and provisioning. And by leveraging things like Argo, we enable their customers to choose builds, like how they want to manage, hey, we want to run on nightly builds. We want this cool feature that it's coming in 3 months from now, but we need it right now. And we enable that fine-grained control of, who's running what where by using all these. Then the most interesting thing on the cost side, which is, I would say, a common thread with people changing business models and going from PaaS to SaaS. It's okay, we are running this. How much is it costing? How much is it per customer? On the share, are there any noisy neighbors that are hogging all the resources? Is there anything better we could do in terms of isolation to ensure, the SLA? And those sort of things through open cost and monitoring, we managed to give them glass pane of everybody, whether they were running their own deployment or as tenants, of the cost and those sort of things. That from the non-technical side of the company, that was one of the big, question marks. Like, sure, we are kind of bringing in-house all this cost of running infrastructure for our customers, whereas we were just operating that in the past. We just had access to our resource group and our, our VMs, and that was it. So this was a really interesting case, and to the skilling point, they learned their ways in Kubernetes, and we did all the knowledge transfer in what we call the cloud native technologies, and the level of confidence when it comes to like, hey, if tomorrow customer X comes asking for GCP, we know what we need to do and we know how to do it. So that was one of these cases that it's really interesting for us. The other thing was this migrate and modernize. This was huge. This was huge, like 250 accounts with 100 teams in 5 regions, using multiple data centers. It was one of those cases of companies making acquisitions without rolling up their tech, and all of a sudden they figure out they need to run more efficient, they need to pick a vendor, and they need to have like a streamlined operation center. They were running these self-managed clusters and self-managed Elasticsearch. And when I asked the first time, why would you go like self-manage on everything? The first answer I got is like, hey, we are running 5 petabytes of Elasticsearch. So we need like that, level of control on our workloads is a key of our solution. And here comes the interesting challenge. It was like, hey, we are moving from all these colo providers, we are moving from AWS, we are moving from some smaller hosting providers, but we need to have 0 downtime. And we were like, well, that's interesting. So what we created there was a blueprint in Terraform, trying to figure out all the deployment and how we will, adapt to the different clouds, the different regions, and the different workloads. We try to guide them through the cloud adoption framework and the multiple well-architected frameworks, because this was part of the exercise. It wasn't just like lift and shift everything from one cloud to the other. It's like, as we continue to acquire companies and different products that serve to our, product, we want to make sure that they are all running under the same criteria, with the same design, with the same idea. The other thing was prioritizing managed resources when it made sense, meaning that we kept Elasticsearch running as a self-managed cluster, the 5 petabytes. I haven't seen anybody like the push of a button you will get from their portals that will support that workload. That will be, that could be fine-tuned as they needed it to be. So we kept that. It had a lot of interesting networking challenges, because we have to use site-to-site VPNs, we have to use point-to-site VPNs, and as we were running and doing the migration without any interruption, the result was 0 downtime. We need to connect data centers from multiple cloud providers and create these virtual networks and all that. The benefits are like, and I think this is what I'm mostly excited about, is this virtual one that connects data centers across the world. So it's with multiple hubs running in multiple locations, with employees accessing as point-to-site and site-to-site connections, and all that topology that remain flexible to add new workloads as they move forward and as they, expand across the globe. We level up the whole networking security solution in terms of firewalls and web application firewalls and the network security and how they were using identities to run their different workloads, and created this unified directory to, I would say, roll up all the acquisitions into a single strategy for security and for deployment. Then these, side-to-side VPN connections with ExpressRoute and hybrid clouds allow them to have these highly available. They are processing, these customer process signals from social media in real time. It's around 1 million transactions per second, right? Like they are monitoring a bunch of accounts and ingesting and running algorithms to provide signals based on what's going on. So all that needs to have zero downtime. And by creating this, agnostic, like metadata center on top of all their data centers and having the ability to move workloads seamlessly across locations, we enable this, zero downtime schema. We provision all these AKS cluster, the managed version, with some caveats like having multiple nodes running in multiple regions and a single control plane. We designed and implemented a DNS schema, which was interesting because it took me 20 years back when I was doing this on-prem, and you start thinking out like, okay, it's not just about the service discovery and using Istio and all those things. It's like how we make sure that services reach their closest point rather than resolving on the internet, and building that forest of DNS on the cloud was something really, really interesting. The other thing was, all the certificate management and rotation and the cert managers within Kubernetes, and having multiple ingress controllers in multiple locations on top of multiple clusters that are all connected to have this high available deployment. Anticipating the question, this was 14 months, and this was 15 people. On their end, they had 30 people working with us, and it was a matter of two things. One was, of course, skilling. They were getting into a new cloud. Some of them were getting into a cloud for the first time. They were running like shipping boxes into a data center. And the time to market, of course, like, hey, our plan is 5 years. They needed us to create this, I would say, like steering committee, because these were all acquisitions. They have no streamlined strategy of the cloud, and we needed to, it's weird because we are doing it from the outside. Create the plan, the change management plan, and go evangelizing throughout the organization and gathering feedback to say like, hey, this is our design. This is where we are seeing your workload. This is how we think you will fit. And it was an interesting exercise.
That's what SouthWorks did, was a plan and evangelization in partnership with those 13, or were you relying on the 13 to
No, we planned with them, but it was interesting because each and every discussion that I had was like, I love the idea, now you have to go change these other people's mind. Like everybody, and what we did was taking the best practices and their battle-tested experience. They've been doing this for a long, long time, and blending into a program that was compelling and that has some technical attributes that they were all after, meaning this being cloud agnostic, even though we were to move to Azure, we are cloud agnostic. This same thing could be running on AWS. We even ran some exercises with them in which we show the exact same patterns running on AWS and then just move the workload. And we did the evangelism piece, if you will, plus the hands-on keyboard support, setting up all these design.
Well, I assume it's part of the plan. The evangelism bit is part of the plan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So these examples you gave or you're giving here, are those typical in terms of scope and size, or are these particularly large?
I think this was one of the largest, given the number of workloads and the complexity on these acquisitions and rolling up all the acquisitions into a single framework for running on the cloud. I would say the previous one is more the typical, around 6 to 9 months, and around, I would say, 6 to 9 people is the usual engagement for these workloads. This was huge, and it was interesting enough that as we were talking with people, it's like, hey, we forgot that we are running this thing that was in the back room that we don't think we needed to migrate, but that exists and it needs to be part of the plan. So it was interesting.
Yeah, that's, you're touching on what I'm most curious about, which is the scoping and planning process, because this is very interesting work that you're doing, but it seems to me that defining what's in the boat and what's not in the boat is a really critical part to making this successful, because um, one of the advantages to bringing an outside vendor in is that scope. And the fact that if you do it internally, it may be more fun in some ways, but it's much more subject to scope creep. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that kind of the sort of sales and scoping and
Yeah.
so forth approach, especially since you started off by telling us you're not an SI. How
So
does it differ from that?
so we came with like the first thing we had to do was, proving our point. Like, we have done this 1,000 times. We're here to help. We know what you're talking about. We know AWS. We know this. We have the experience. And then we ran 2 parallel exercises that were really interesting to come up to a full scope. The first one was the critical path. So we look at, sure, what's your service? What's the core component? And let's, dissect the dependencies, which was really interesting and surfaced like 80% of it, which in an internal scenario, that's where the scope creep kicks in, right? Like, sure, this is only what we need. So I knew that that will happen. So we said like, okay, let's forget about everything that we just talked and let's figure out the best migration path. What's the less, like, where is the least amount of risk to migrate? Which are the satellite things that we can start trying with as a science project, so you get, your feet in the water. And that was the other 20%, because it was like, hey, this is like, we weren't considering this as part of the critical path, but it is connected. So it's interesting because when you are inside, and I've been there, like I work as a CTO for a startup and I run a multi-region deployments and stuff like that, you are looking always at your critical workloads, like the things that would, get you up 3 a.m. if they go down. But we know that there is more than that. So by creating this parallel exercise and figuring out the overlap, like, hey, here is a dependency to the service that you weren't considering as part of the critical path, but you have that, and you're suggesting that as, the first workload to migrate, we were able to articulate the full scope. And one of the interesting outcomes of that exercise was giving them back a full map and inventory of their systems. That when I spoke with their CTO, it was like, well, I've been asking for this for the last 5 years. Like, nobody was able to do this to me because I have a VP of engineering of acquisition A, and I have like a CDO from acquisition C, and each one of them have their own thing. But they said, like, we just have APIs and APIs that connect everybody. And it's like, if we need to roll it up, I need to see this. And that was kind of the tipping point to say, like, okay, you have gone, deep enough to understand our infrastructure. You have a plan, and you understand 2 ways, right? Like, the traditional critical path, this is what we need to get over there to call it migrated or done, but also the, satellite things that we are running that make part of our day-to-day that we weren't considering. So by doing that, all that took us like 2 months as part of our, I'll call it pre-sales exercise, we were able to, earn the trust and also give away a bunch of these, I would say, deliverables like this. Here is your map. Here is how each and every component talk to each other, sort of thing.
So I have a question that's in line with what Guy was talking about. So my experience with these types of engagements, I always call them, do you teach people to fish or do you feed them fish? Right? So in other words, you come in with a given scope, a given amount of people, a given amount of time. After that's done, do you have to leave people there, or are they continually Or how do they maintain it themselves?
Due to the nature of our customers, which I started by saying, like, they all have engineering teams and they all know what they are doing. We teach them to fish, and we could be around as much as they need us to be. But ideally, we work on an integrated fashion, if you will. Like, we will welcome their resources if they want to work side by side to us. We will welcome their tech leads if they want to review our pull request and the work that we are doing, and those sort of things, because in our experience, doing this type of work and then saying, like, sure, we have saved the last month to, get everybody in a conference room and I will walk you through what we've done, doesn't work, right? And we lead by saying this sort of like, we just help you get there and then we move on. We do have some smaller type of engagements in which we can support like hands-on keyboard for a period of time, but our ultimate goal and the success would be for them to say, like, sure, thank you for all the fish, but we can take it from there.
So I have a question about the cloud agnostic setup that you talked about. One of the things that has been sort of bugging me for a while about cloud agnostic configurations is that, sort of by definition, if you're going to use especially the big full-featured clouds like Azure and AWS and Google Cloud, then if you're going to build a cloud agnostic infrastructure across multiple clouds, or something that can be easily moved across multiple clouds, almost by definition, you can't use the advanced services and features that they offer. And so basically you're kind of dumbing down those clouds and making them into a simple lowest common denominator cloud. But from what you've described, it sounds like you guys aren't doing that. It sounds like you are using some of these advanced features. You're in an unusual position to be able to kind of answer one of my core questions, which is, how do you build a best of breed infrastructure that uses advanced services in a cloud agnostic world?
That is a great question. And I think that, it's one of the biggest challenges, that it's like we are choosing a cloud because of their features, but then we are looking for
But then we're not using the features.
The common denominator.
Yeah.
So by creating abstraction layers, different Kubernetes operators, and giving services based on the design of these services, the ability to tap into those advanced features if they are available, we allow best of both worlds, right? That it's like, okay, what's the bare minimum that needs to work on this environment, and what are the power apps that you can get? If you go with and I have heard this a lot of times, if you go with that mentality of like, we'll just choose the common denominator and it's just the cloud, it's an utility provider, you are missing out. But if you are designing cloud first, then you're just going against the market. And we have seen those swings back and forth, driven just by the market. It's no longer a technical decision. It's like, hey, since AWS decided to go into Amazon Pharmacy, all of the healthcare customers want to be out of AWS in the next 18 months. Or those sort of scenarios that are like, sure, if you are all in, then it's a problem, but you want to be all in. So we enable these solutions to tap into best of breed when it comes to the cloud services, but drawing the line in like, hey, this is what will work, and these are the power apps. Since you are running here, these are the advantages that you are getting for running on Azure.
So when you help an organization sort of migrate to or build an environment that's somewhat cloud agnostic, have you found that they stick with it, or do they end up using some of those features that you talked about, that are the advanced features, that then they're no longer cloud agnostic after a time? Do they sort of devolve into?
So I think, and it's interesting from the standpoint of service availability. For the core services, compute, storage, and networking, I would say they stick pretty much to, Kubernetes and the infrastructure that we put in place. There are some edge cases on different clouds when it comes to things like BigQuery on GCP or Azure OpenAI on Azure, in which they are making a conscious decision of, Like, hey, we are running this service here. We are using this because there is no other alternative. And we know that if and when we need to go through this again, then we'll need to figure out a solution for this part of the workloads, right? But pretty much for the, I would say the core component, they stick with that because the open source world and all these cool projects move faster than the cloud. So we are reaching a point when we started working with Kubernetes a long time ago, where it was still Google thing, right? Like everybody called it Google container thing. The cloud was more advanced, right? Like if you went like Azure specific or GCP specific or AWS specific, you would get things that weren't available. Now we are reaching a point in which that is inverting, where all these projects are doing a lot of cool features and stuff and enabling a lot of different scenarios that they are not enabled by default. So if you want to do this, multiple rollout and have like an inventory and use Argo to manage the cluster and have drift detection, all those sort of things aren't available by default on AWS or Azure or GCP. So I think that there is not only the philosophical point to sticking to cloud native or cloud agnostic, there is actual value. There is actual like, hey, we are getting things that these vendors do not provide.
So when customers come to you, well, maybe I can flip it a bit. What are the kinds of customers that come to you, and how do you tell when they're ready? So are there customers that come to you and you say, yeah, we are not a good fit, or you are not ready to do this? Or what are the good customers look like?
I think that the ones that we would call the good customers are the ones that are open to a modernization, multi-cloud, and that sort of scenario on like, okay, let me open the hood and figure out if we can do things better. I wouldn't call a perfect fit those that are like, hey, I have all these EC2 instance and I need to turn those into, Azure VMs, and that's it. It's a common lift and shift, and we want it to be multi-cloud because we know we cannot succeed. So it's basically when we look at the workloads and we look internally at their tech team, what they are after, if they are just looking for a carbon copy and it's like what we built is fantastic and we see that there is no feasible way of staying true to this, multi-cloud open promise, we say like, well, we might not be the perfect fit for your workload. Because as with everything, I hate getting into the philosophical, political discussion. And of course, being somebody that helps from the outside, sometimes our job is to tell people that their babies are ugly. And it's like, it's not a comfortable place for every day. If they know that up front and they are open to like, let's think through together, then it's easier. If you come to me with like, hey, I solved it, I just need to make it work on this other cloud, and I start with all my feedback sessions and you don't like what I'm saying, then it becomes a heated discussion that I would rather not be part of. I have one more. This is one that it's really interesting. This was what we call a cloud native company. They are building a company, a device, and a service from day one on the cloud. And what's interesting is that aside from everything that goes into like, hey, this is cool and we are using plenty of AI and those sort of things, the ask here was like, we need to be ready to be a success overnight. And it's like, it's one of those like scenarios in which like we have pitched our technology to investors and everybody is pouring money into us. And we don't know how it will work out when it goes to a market, but it needs to scale rapidly. And if it catches fire, we need to be ready for that. And by the way, we want to change everything, right? They have a super talented and smart team that knew what was wrong, what won't work. And these were people that work in companies like Apple, building like iCloud. So they knew what they were talking about. They were just like, we want you to help us find that middle ground, because based on our experience, we would just build everything from the ground up, right? Like the solution in which we've been working is like, even if we need to run our own containerization engine, we would do it. And it's like, well, I don't know. I don't know if that's the best use of your time. And, you know, with the time to market and the sensitivity of like, if this catches fire, if you will be ready compared to things like Docker, who has been out for a long, long time and it's battle tested. So with them, we created this governance schema, again, with best practices and the cloud adoption framework. We had to design a active high availability, which is one of the most interesting challenges when it comes to distributed computing and not being just resilient, but operating from two active locations. We created all these solutions for hyperscale, like what would happen if we start needing to moving containers across the world, literally. Like, hey, we start here in the West Coast in the US, tomorrow it could be Central, tomorrow it could be East, tomorrow it could be Europe, and do all that with security and the best practices from Kubernetes and this thing about self-service, which is something that we love about these distributed teams working on, I'll call microservice architectures or those sort of things, where you have like teams that are responsible for, hey, I'm the identity team or I'm the analytics team. And we want to make sure that whenever we put something out there, it's compliant with the rest of the thing, and our service could be discovered and it will be maintained and it's resilient and, gets all the goodies from the core services. So creating this governance scheme means creating a framework and just like, blueprint images and those sort of packages, rather than just, a consulting thing where I would tell people like, this is how you manage dependencies. We try to put it through, this notion of an internal company open source, where you have like the blueprint. This is where what we are using to migrate your workloads. But if you need to run a new one, go here. If something is wrong, then just, upgrade the open source internal project. And we bring that open source mentality into that company, which I love and I think was great.
Hey, John, can I ask you one question? Sorry. Can't go to the next slide yet. When you come in and work with companies, how often do you find that you can work with their DevOps pipeline tool chain process that they have in place? Or do you typically just set up your own so that you're not kind of complicated or slowed down by what they're doing? And if you have to set up your own, how do you turn that over?
So we try to find a middle ground. And I try, and this is like what I tell my team, that it's like you leave politics, religion, and philosophy out the door. So if they are using Jenkins and they're happy with it and it serves our purpose, so be it. We are not in a position to start a political battle. So we try not to disrupt the whole thing. And we try to ride their pipelines, and whatever is that we're bringing new, we try to explain why we need that and why it's valuable and what's the upside and why they need to keep that after we're gone. So I know that, as with everything, people develop these like, hey, I'm a, Circle CI person, or I'm a GitHub Action person. There are some particular cases in which we say like, hey, you need to run your own runners within your own network. And these are the top 3 vendors that support that. What you are doing does not support that. And this is important in terms of security, in terms of availability. We are not telling you which one to pick, and we won't pick for you. If you ask us, we'll have our opinion, but we try to stay away of like, hey, I don't like that one. Just change it because we are used to, GitHub Actions. So it's a complicated thing. And again, we try not to operate in, I would say, in the blank canvas, because we come with our ideas, and I've been on the other side of the table with where all these great ideas sound fantastic, but then you need to live with it, right? And it sounds great for a 6-month project, but then you're gone, and it's like, hey, what's the point of running CVE detection for new things and getting all this pipeline running if it doesn't work? So it's finding that common ground and leaving the fanatism out the door, even though you have like meetings with people from my team wearing like, I don't know, GitLab. And it's like, hey, but we are a GitHub shop. It's fine. Like they just like that and it's okay. So we try not to get into that discussion unless there is this thing like, hey, we are using this source control that only allows for check-in, check-out, non-distributed sort of thing. And it's like, well, that won't do for what you are trying to build here.
So I actually thought Mitch was going to ask the security question. So I will ask the security question. You saved it for me. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about security. And I noticed you put on, sort of the results of implemented security measures. And, security is sort of a big buzzword. And it's, I think in a lot of development environments, it's a bolt-on afterthought. And I'm wondering how you sort of approach security. What's your philosophical approach to it and implementing it? And what do you do in terms of teaching and stuff like that?
It's a question that I love because it's a subject that I love. And the approach that we have to security is to, let's look at the traditional certification bodies, call it SOC 2, high trust, and those sort of things. And let's try to separate those things that are actionable and we can bring into the development and DevOps process from those that, you need to do it if you want the seal from the certificating body. You need to do it with a compliance person that will write a policy and you put a check mark. So we don't get entangled in processes and stuff like that. We try to look at the control areas, call it risk management, call it monitoring, change management, and identity or logical and physical access. And we try to convey from those things which are actionable. So you're running Kubernetes already. Why don't you use, manage identities instead of running everything anonymous and then figuring out, or then, using your own sort of thing. Same thing with monitoring. So we know that everybody loves talking about monitoring. For me, it's like security. But what does it mean? Like, do you have the information that you need to have? If you have an incident, you can really pinpoint what happened and provide an answer and then go fix it. If that's what we're talking when it comes to monitoring, let's figure out what are the proper process and tools. Let's bring in Prometheus and let's bring this and that. If we are talking security about like, sure, you shouldn't commit code that it's not tested, or you should have, it's not our job. We are hands-on people. We think in practical terms. We can give recommendations in sense of like, hey, you should be running a firewall, or networking works this way, or you should run your build process inside your network, and those sort of things, rather than, talking about processes from a philosophical standpoint or a, business consulting standpoint. So we look at it from, and we have like our own framework of like, hey, if you're talking about identity, these are the things you need to consider. How do you do like management? What are the identity types and how you're planning the identity for each one of the workloads? And how are you dealing with secrets? And what if there is a leak on the secrets that goes into source control? Are you able to, detect that before it hits production? And those sort of things are the things that we talk when we talk about security. Networking, DevOps, and stuff like that, I won't come with like, sure, you need to install only software that you know, and those sort of things from a more, I would say, compliance process standpoint. That's not our arena.
So talking about your arena, I've got a couple of questions really. It's like, what's the boundary of the scope that you work upon? A lot of the things you've talked about here are around kind of infrastructure and platform building. Is that as far as you go? Is it that you provide kind of like platform engineering as a service to people, or do you provide developers that help with the application? Because the way I see it at the moment, the more we go into this landscape, the more the lines are blurred, the more the platforms are integrated into the actual applications themselves. So I'm kind of wondering, so my first one is, where's your boundary? And secondly, you can follow on with a bit with what makes a good Southie, because that kind of skill set kind of feeds into that.
I love both questions. I'll start with the first one from 15 years ago. 15 years ago, you would get into a room with people and they will ask you, are you a back-end person or a front-end person? That line became a little bit blurry, right? Like, well, let's call it full stack. So I do everything from the API up to, the Vue.js tweaking of the front-end client. What we are seeing right now, as you said, is that more and more services are becoming dependent on the underlying infrastructure. And I think that we need to be flexible in the sense of like, if we need to go into the code base and create an abstraction layer that talks to Google Blobs or Google Files or S3 or Azure Storage, we would do it. We would rather have the abstraction at the infra level and do platform engineering. But to be honest, that's not true. That's not how the world operates. It's the ideal world. So when it comes to the ideal Saudi, I would say we look at that flexibility and the willingness to unlearn what you know. Meaning that, hey, we were used to do all this abstraction by building libraries that run with the code base and stuff like that. Now we are talking about Kubernetes operators that provide this API. Sure, if you are willing to, make that switch, that's awesome. And I would say it's not just the willingness, but it's the passion that comes with it, because this moves really fast. So, and I love that the CNCF has logos and cool names and mascots for each one of the projects. So, and it's really hard to keep up, because 10 years ago, you would just look at Microsoft or Oracle, and it's like, what's the next Java version? And, they support generics, and that's great. And the next project will come, you get the heads up 1 year in advance, right? Like next year with C#3, you're getting all these goodies. Now it's like, hey, it's live. It's being battle tested by Netflix, who has built this project. It's open source. It exists. And it's like, where did it come from? Well, Netflix or Airbnb or these startups that are building technology that are not the traditional, ISB. So you need to have the passion and you need to love what you do. And I hate the cliche of I want people that love what they do. But it's like, it's an industry where you need to be engaged. And engage in meaning that you need to enjoy reading what's going on, willing to try things out, and understanding that just, one skill no longer do, right? Like if you know C#, that's great. But in this actual present, you need to know everything. And full stack now means from Terraform up to, Vue.js or React Native, everything in between. It's no longer I know how to write an API and I know some HTML so I can write a nice web app. That's the vision that we have for it.
I just want to come toward the end of time, but just very quick. Do you find that that's a very difficult skill set to fulfill and scale?
I think that from a skill set standpoint, it's hard because nobody knows everything. And I see this with my team that they are usually, they became fans of something that it's new and it has 3 days, and they go to an interview with a candidate and they ask about all these questions about like, do you know this? And have you used it? And it's like, sure, like this has like 2 months, like nobody will have that. So the question would be like, are you willing to learn this? And I think that as an industry, we're on a tipping point where we still have a lot of people that look for, I would say, expertise niche, and that's probably not a good fit for us. Whereas we have a lot of people that are honest and transparent and say like, hey, I don't know what that project with a beaver is, but I'm willing to go, look at it and learn a new thing and be happy with it. So it's changing, but it's been tough because I would say 2 years ago, as I was interviewing people, I was like, I'm the Node.js expert. And it's like, everybody wants Python now. And it's like, what do I do with a Node.js expert? If you say like, hey, I just love programming and I love writing APIs, and if I need to learn how to interact with an operator or write one myself, I will go do it. Then you are the perfect person for our company. Otherwise, you feel like, no, I would just work on projects that are on Azure with C# and, that use serverless components because I love how you put things and they just work, versus like, I don't want to have anything to do with containers and knowing how to optimize a base layer of an image and those sort of things. Then you're just, missing out. We've seen that with the front end versus back end full stack thing change. I expect that to happen in the next couple of years with these, like, you're a platform person. You just go above and beyond. And if we need to talk routing tables or, optimizing a piece of source code, then you're fine with it. Come here and learn.